Hey guys, this is Nate with Zbroz. Today we're going to go over how to install our spring kits for the Polaris Pro R with Fox Dynamics live valve shocks and the Turbo R. The process is basically the same. Springs are obviously different from 2 and 4 seat, and whether it's a Turbo R or a Pro R like we have here, but the process of how to get the shocks off, how to put the springs on, and the basics are all in this video. So we'll show you how to do it. And on those applications like the XP1000,
we supply a divider that's cut down.
billet nut. Another Honda Talent. This happens to be a 1000R. All right, so the tools you're gonna need: a hammer and a punch for the crossover nut, straight screwdriver for your bump stop, a T40 to remove the fender, 21mm end wrench, 15mm end wrench, and then a 15mm socket and 21mm socket and ratchet. All right, so on the front, we're gonna need to remove the shock completely in order to get the springs off because of the clevis design and the way this front end is designed. So the first step's gonna be to get a T40 and remove your fender, not completely, but enough that you can get it out of the way to slide the shock out of the car. Now, this is just what we've found over the last few months of testing. If there's a better way, I guess you can try it. But you want to be able to slide this fender out like this, because you'll see later when we need to get the shock out, we need to have that room. We need to undo the lower shock mount. And now we're working on the passenger side right now, but one thing that makes it way easier to get these off is remove both lower shock bolts. So even though we're working on this side, we're gonna jump over and we're gonna undo the shock bolt on the other side so that the sway bar that's connected doesn't mess with this, allows us to get it fully extended. Now that we've got both lower shock bolts removed, we want to actually undo the upper ball joint, and this is a 15mm. So remove that, the bolt that holds the upper ball joint in place. It should just fall out, and this, we're gonna need this extra room in order to get the shock out. All right, so there's 2 connectors on these live valves. So one is pretty obvious out here, and then there's one that's actually on a little clip, and you can slide it off of that black clip and then just disconnect the connector like that. The other item to pay attention to is this little zip tied location. Now you don't need to cut the zip tie, you can just pull on that little, I don't know, push pin bracket, and it pulls it out of the way. And this will give you easier access to getting to your upper shock bolt. You just tuck these out of the way for right now. And then using your 21mm, we've got to go up in here and loosen the upper shock bolt. Hopefully you can see that. Yep, right there. Top shock bolt is out. Now this is the tricky part, because you've got to lift the shock up in and get it off of the axle, if that makes sense. Then you can swing it out here, have somebody hold the fender out of the way. You just have to work the shock up out of the arm. So as you can see, having the fender undone is necessary. So at this point now, it's a good idea to use some compressed air and brake parts cleaner and get your threads really clean. If you do not have any kind of a spring compressor like we have here, or you can also rent the clamp type from, you know, an AutoZone or O'Reilly or whatever, and compress the mainspring to help you back the preload off. You can leave it on the car and you can back the preload all the way off. You can put this end in a vise and back the preload off by hand. Obviously a spring compressor is going to be the easiest way. A lot of shops will have those, but if you don't, you can rent some and compress the mainspring, you know, an inch or so on each side with the clamp style. They just kind of go like this and pull the spring down. That's one way to get some of the preload off so that you're able to back the preload all the way off, because we've got to get this loose in order to put the new springs on. Okay, and you make sure that you push your bump stop up out of the way so that you're not fighting it when you're trying to take the retainer off. In this application, we're able to just use a spring compressor, so it's really easy. This side. Hang on to your factory divider. It's going to go back on the same direction. All right, so we have our new spring pack pulled out. So it's going to be the 12-inch mainspring with the 10-inch tender for the front. They should be labeled in your kit, and the crossover divider, spring divider, is going to go on the same direction. Don't worry about your crossover just yet, but your preload, you're going to have to back the preload off. Now it's going to vary. We're seeing cars, obviously they're going to get set up differently from dealers, but lots of them with factory springs have a crap load of preload. We want to start with a minimal amount, and so with our given spring length, we know that on the Pro R and Turbo R, we want to start with about somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch of preload on the front. So this is a Turbo or a Pro R, excuse me. So we're just going to bring the preload nut up until we have about a 3/4 of an inch gap. Now you can also do this the same way by, after you put the springs on and they're loose, put it back on the car, make sure that the wheel is fully extended, and then just count your revolutions. And a good rule of thumb on this car would probably be about 8 turns of preload, 6 to 8 turns of preload from loose. This does have an internal spring in it, so when it's free out of the car, it's actually about 1/2 inch, maybe shorter than what it's supposed to be. So we can't just simply put this on, but we are giving you a decent gauge on the Pro R, about 3/4 of an inch from the edge of this top bridge cap down to the top of the preload nut. So we're going to set that at 3/4 of an inch, and we're going to put our spring pack on with our machine here and get that in place. Okay, upside down. I kind of jumped a step, but it is a little bit easier to do your decal when you have your springs out of the way, but you can still do it after. So we're going to peel off the Fox and replace it with the stage 1 decal for the spring kit. And usually they'll come off pretty easy. Obviously, if it leaves adhesive and things like that, carb cleaner, parts cleaner softens that up, and you can just wipe it off with a rag, or there's adhesive remover that you can buy. But I like to just peel the edge up with a knife and then start from either side and peel it off slowly. All right, going back on is going to be kind of the same process. Just have to kind of fish it down in, get it over your axle. Then once it drops down in, you're able to slide it up in and put your top shock bolt back in. Just reverse the process. One thing to note on this car during this installation, is not running a front sway bar, so there would normally be a front sway bar and linkage that is sort of in your way, but it's pretty much out of the way. But just note that this car is not running a front sway bar, so it's not shown in the video. All right, so we want to make sure we hook back up our connectors, and there's a pretty positive click on those. You can slide this one back into its little bracket, put this back into the little detent hole there, make sure they're tight, and now we'll tighten up the lower shock bolt. But in this case, we're going to complete the other side and then finish all that, because we need to leave that undone while we do the other side. On the front, earlier in the video, I talked about the preload setting and the distance up here. It's actually only about a 1/2 inch. You want about a 1/2 inch gap from the top cap to the preload nut. And that's going to give you about 1/4 inch of preload, and that's a good starting point. And then once we get the shock hooked up, we can set the crossover distance at full extension when the wheel and tire are hooked up, so we can make sure the shock is fully extended. We're going to go 4 1/4 inches from the divider to the crossover nut. And that's a good starting point for a car that's fairly stock, doesn't have a bunch of added weight, any kind of added weight, winch, things like that. You would need to run a little bit more preload or a little bit more crossover. But what we're finding on these cars especially, you don't want to get too much preload in the car. They already want to set pretty tall with this spring setup, so minimal amount of preload and start at 4 1/4 on crossover, and then you can go down from there if you need more bottoming resistance. All right, so moving back to the rear, you're going to want to locate your rear springs. It's fairly obvious. The rear main is an 18 inch. The rear tender, excuse me, is a 10 inch as well. So it's the same length as the front, but it's the smaller wire diameter. So the part number has a 225 at the end of the part number. So, but they're very similar, but this wire diameter is going to be smaller, and that is going to be your tender for the rear. So locate those, and then using your 21, we want to remove the lower shock bolt first. And you can take this shock all the way off and use a spring compressor, or just like we talked about on the front, you can just back the preload off by hand. You'll want to clean the threads, blow those out, and then back the preload all the way off. Using a screwdriver also, just like the front, wedge it in there and kind of move the bump stop up out of your way. And depending on how much preload, may or may not be beneficial to use a spring compressor. It's going to vary again based on what your dealer is doing as far as setup. So on this one, I know it's got minimal preload, so we'll probably just back the preload off by hand. All right, so up inside on this shock, you're going to have 2 connectors again. One that's going to be kind of back in and pops off that retainer, and then the other one, it's hard to see back here, right here. So it's the same setup as the front, so remove both those connectors before you take the shock out. Okay. All right, if you're going to pull the shock off, you can pull your intake. It's actually the clutching intake tube out of the way. There's a lower clamp and then an upper clamp, and you can move this plastic tube completely out of your way, and then you can get to that shock bolt a lot easier. Okay, so undo your upper clamp and your lower clamp, and you can set this out of the way, and then you're able to get to the shock easier. Also access your, and this is on the passenger side, driver's side is a little bit different. We'll try to get some pictures of that as well. All right, so to get your preload out, if you're gonna do it on the car, you know, we've shown you both ways of doing it. If you're gonna do it on the car, make sure you clean it with some kind of parts cleaner and compressed air. This car was really clean, but it's been to the sand. And as you know, the sand gets in everything. So once we cleaned it and blew it off with air. Then we utilized like a little bit of WD-40 or this Tri-Flow works really good to put on the threads so that you're able to break the preload nut loose. The biggest thing you want to do is if it's not moving, clean it more, use a little bit of lube to get it to back off. You just don't want to damage your threads. So once it breaks free and if everything's clean, it should move freely by hand. So just keep that in mind, and then clean off your excess Tri-Flow or WD-40, whatever you're using, because that's just going to attract sand. So after you use it to get it loose, clean it again with carb cleaner or brake parts cleaner. So at this point, now that it's loose, we're able to pull the retainer off. That's going to get reused, so you don't want to lose that. And then you can drop your spring pack all the way off. Again, if you have a spring compressor, you can take the shock off and just do it on a spring compressor. So we're just trying to show you both ways. Hey, while we got the springs off, this is a good time to remove the decal and put the new decal on. Austin, come here and get out of the seat and lift up on that other side. All right, so the crossover on these dynamic shocks they have a wear sleeve for the body, so you still just break the two nuts loose and then you can move the crossover where you need to, but that sleeve is going to float and move with your bottom crossover nut. So all right, so spring stack's going to go back together just like stock. Divider, long lip facing down. Slide it back on. Now, an important thing to note on these is there's an internal spring, so don't get too worried about your preload setting just yet. You're going to want to hook up your shock bolt so that the shock will fully extend. This is where having a little bit of help is nice. Go up a little bit, Austin. Okay. So if you pay attention, as I push down on this, the shock's going to extend a fair bit. You almost have to sit on the hub in order to get it to extend all the way. A bit of weight on it. And we want, in the rear, a good starting point is a 1/2 inch of preload. So we'll give you a measurement, but in order to get everything back together, you've got to get everything fully extended and pretty much have the preload backed off. And then take a measurement while sitting on the car like this, making sure that it's fully extended. And spring packs 28 3/4 when it's loose. So that means we're going to need to have this preload nut to the retainer. We need to move it about a 1/2 inch. So our number that we're shooting for is 28 1/4. And I'll give you a number from the top up here too, and that's just a good starting point. Okay, so a good starting point is going to be right around 6 3/4 inches. And that's from the bottom of the bridge or top cap to the top of the preload nut. Now that we have that set, we want to go ahead and set our crossover. And crossover is always going to be set at full extension. So making sure the shock's fully extended. We want a travel number of about 4 1/2 inches. So turn this up. And again, we're trying to measure from, see if I can turn this a little bit and make it easier to see, from the divider, the top edge of the divider, to the bottom of the crossover nut. We want to get 4 1/2 inches. Okay. Once you have that crossover nut set, you can just tap on that top nut and just tighten it down on the bottom one. You don't need to kill it, just get it snug. And now the crossover and the preload is set for a starting point. And now if you did take the whole shock off, make sure you get all your lines, connectors hooked back up, torque your top shock bolt, and then put your clutch intake tube back on. So we're gonna go ahead and do that now. Okay, and one thing to note, your bottom retainer is notched, and then of course the guard goes forward just like it was stock.
Okay, recording.
All right, so jump back to the front. Now that the preload is set, we're gonna hook back up our upper ball joint and our shock position and make sure the shock is fully extended, and then we'll set our crossover on the front at around 4 inches. So I'm gonna do all that now so we can go back together. Okay, so we've got both of the front spring kits installed. And at that point, you're able to hook back up your upper A-arm ball joint bolt and then hook up the lower shock bolt. And again, remember we had to have them both unhooked so that we could get it to droop out all the way because of the sway bar. So once you get both of them done, you can finish these last 2 steps, torquing the upper ball joint and torquing your lower shock mount. All right, don't forget to put your fender back on when you're all done. All of the bolts that come out are going to be the same length, except for this front one is short. So the short bolt, the T40 Torx, is going to be up front. Everything else of those 5 or 6 that come out, 2, 3 of the 6 that come out are going to be the longer length. All right, so as you can see, to install the spring kit on your Pro R Turbo R is pretty straightforward. The same as most other spring kits. This front end is a little bit more complicated because of having to remove the shock completely in order to get that lower retainer off. But just remember, any extra weight that you might have, you'll need to play with your preload from our initial settings. And then remember your crossover, you can utilize that to fine tune your broad ring resistance. So check out the spring kit at zbrozracing.com or reach out to your local Zbroz dealer and like and share online.